There's a parking spot at CIA headquarters that's been there for 30 years. Every weekday morning, at roughly the same hour, a man pulled in, cut the engine, gathered his things, and walked through the front door like everyone else reporting for work. He had a badge. He had clearance. He had colleagues who complained to him about the coffee. He attended meetings. He filed reports. He nodded in hallways. He was, by every external measure, completely ordinary. And somewhere across the world, in a city the CIA was spending billions to understand, men were being taken from their homes and shot. The CIA had already caught their traitor. The mystery was solved. The wound was located. So why were there people still dying? In 1985, CIA assets inside the Soviet Union started going silent. Not one or two. Not the statistical noise of a hard operating environment. Almost every significant human intelligence source the agency had cultivated inside the Soviet system, some of them over the course of decades, vanished inside the same narrow window of time. These were people who had chosen, at enormous personal risk, to work with American intelligence. Some were motivated by ideology, genuine disillusionment with the state they served. Some by money. All of them knew exactly what exposure meant. In the Soviet Union, working with a foreign service wasn't treated as a crime to be prosecuted. It was treated as a matter for a specific room at Lefortovo prison. You entered. You did not come back out. The CIA called this period, quietly, among themselves, the Year of the Spy. They would later discover they had the name exactly right. Just the wrong spy. At first, they had a suspect. His name was Edward Lee Howard. Howard was a former CIA officer, young, trained, and prepared for a Moscow posting when a routine polygraph examination in 1983 uncovered problems: drug use, petty theft, the behavioral record of someone the institution had decided it couldn't trust in the field. The CIA terminated him, abruptly, without ceremony. Howard didn't take it well. There is a specific kind of bitterness that comes from being rejected by the thing you built your entire identity around entering. Howard was vocal about it, unstable about it. When he made contact with the KGB in 1985, it was not ideology, it was damage. The FBI placed Howard under physical surveillance outside his home in New Mexico. He had been taught CIA counter-surveillance techniques, including one for slipping from a moving vehicle using a dummy to maintain the appearance of an occupied seat. He used it. His wife drove. He rolled out at a curve in the road. By the time FBI agents realized the passenger was a prop, Howard had reached a payphone. By the time anyone thought to watch the airports, he was already in Helsinki. Days later, he surfaced in Moscow. The Soviet Union gave him an apartment. He would live there, largely forgotten, until his death from a broken neck in 2002, officially attributed to a fall in his backyard. He was 50 years old. The KGB had no further use for him. The agency exhaled. Howard explained the losses. The mystery had a name and a face and a location. Then another asset went silent. Then another after that. Howard had been gone from the agency before most of these people were ever activated as sources. He could not have given them up, which meant someone else had. Someone still inside, still reading the files, still coming to work. The CIA formed a mole hunt in late 1985. Officially, it didn't exist. Officially acknowledging a live penetration inside the agency was the kind of wound that compounds. The admission alone reshapes every operation you're currently running, every source you're currently protecting, every relationship built on the premise that CIA intelligence is secure. So the working group was small, informal on paper, and given a narrow mandate: identify the source of the ongoing compromise. They had a short list of suspects. Only a limited number of officers had access to the specific assets that were being burned. The list was examined. Names were added and removed. Polygraphs were administered. One name on the list was Aldrich Ames. They decided he was not the problem. They asked him to help find it. The CIA formed a mole hunt to find the person destroying their network, and Aldrich Ames joined the mole hunt. The man who had walked into the Soviet embassy 10 months earlier, who had already given up the names of officers currently being detained in Moscow, was now sitting in a conference room at CIA headquarters, reviewing the list of people suspected of doing exactly what he was doing. He read the reports. He knew which names they were focusing on. He knew which investigative techniques they were testing. He knew, in real time, how close they were. And he told the KGB everything. For 9 years, the CIA investigated itself. For 9 years, the man responsible sat inside the investigation room. The losses accelerated through 1986 and 1987. Gennady Varenik was a KGB officer who had been providing intelligence to CIA handlers for several years. His code name was GT Fitness. In early 1986, he stopped responding. An emergency extraction signal was sent through a dead drop outside Moscow. It went unanswered. Varenik had been arrested. He was executed shortly afterward. Ames had known his name. Inside CIA headquarters, a senior officer named Brian Kelly was placed under serious suspicion by the mole hunt. His career was effectively frozen. His colleagues began treating him with the cautious distance that institutional suspicion produces. Investigators built a case against him that pointed, when followed to its conclusion, at nothing. Kelly was not the mole. He was a man whose life the investigation consumed while the actual mole continued attending its meetings. It would take years before the damage to Kelly's career was acknowledged, and even then, only partially. The investigation was not just failing to find the traitor, it was destroying innocent people in the process. And the traitor was watching. On April 16, 1985, roughly 3 weeks after being cleared by the mole hunt's initial review, Aldrich Ames walked into the Soviet embassy on Wisconsin Avenue in Washington, D.C., and offered to sell information for $50,000. He told himself it was a one-time arrangement, a controlled transaction. He had debts from a divorce, debts from a lifestyle he had built slightly beyond his salary, and the particular anxiety of a man who sees the distance between what he earns and what he spends widening every year. $50,000 would close the distance. He would do it once and stop. He did not stop. Ames entered the Soviet embassy carrying a sealed envelope. Inside was a piece of paper identifying him as a CIA officer and naming 3 KGB officers who had been turned by American intelligence. The information was genuine. He handed it to a Soviet diplomat at the front desk and waited. He was brought to an interior room. He was given a name to contact. He left through the front door, walked to his car, and drove back to Langley. He had been inside for less than an hour. When he returned to his desk, his colleagues were still at lunch. Within 6 weeks, the KGB had paid him $50,000. Within the year, they had paid him far more. Within the decade, the total would reach somewhere between $2 and $3 million. He spent it in ways that were not subtle. Ames paid $540,000 in cash for a house in Arlington, Virginia. He bought a Jaguar. His wife's credit card records, reviewed later by investigators, showed tens of thousands of dollars spent on clothing, furniture, travel, and restaurant meals. He deposited large cash sums into bank accounts without the pattern of behavior that someone worried about detection would have produced. There were no offshore accounts, no complex financial structures, no laundry. He simply spent the money and deposited what was left, on a government salary of roughly $70,000 a year. Colleagues noticed. Some of them mentioned it. The house, the car. One assumed he had family money. The explanation that required less imagination was the correct one. Nobody reached for it. The evidence had been generating itself for years, in plain sight, on a government salary, in a parking lot that anyone could drive past. It simply had not been assembled in the same room at the same time by someone willing to follow it to the only conclusion it supported. By 1991, the mole hunt had been running for 6 years and had found nothing it could prosecute. A new CIA counterintelligence chief authorized a more systematic approach. 2 analysts, Sandy Grimes and Jean Vertefeuille, were given access to the full financial records of the remaining suspects and told to follow the money with the kind of rigor that earlier reviews had not applied. When Grimes cross-referenced the timeline of Ames's known contacts with Soviet officials against the timeline of specific asset losses, the correlation appeared immediately. Every significant loss tracked within weeks of a meeting Ames had logged as routine. When she overlaid his financial records, the picture became something that could not be explained away. The FBI placed Ames under physical surveillance in May 1993. Agents followed him for months, photographing his movements, logging his routes, noting every stop. They also collected his trash. This required no warrant. Material placed at the curb for collection is legally accessible. Inside Ames's garbage, over several weeks, agents found torn documents. Reassembled, they revealed notes from KGB communication protocols, references to upcoming meetings, evidence of an active and ongoing intelligence relationship with Moscow. The man had been tearing up his communications rather than burning them. The pieces were in a plastic bag on a public street. In October 1993, agents placed a device inside Ames's home computer while he was traveling. They found encrypted files, financial transfers, the full architecture of a relationship that had been running for 8 years. On February 21, 1994, the FBI arrested Aldrich Ames on his way to CIA headquarters. He had driven the same route he drove every morning. He was wearing the same coat. He was carrying the same briefcase. The only difference was that this time, the men watching the parking lot finally knew what they were looking at. For nearly a decade, Aldrich Ames had lived with a simple assumption that nobody was really looking. On February 21, 1994, that assumption ended. The evidence against him was overwhelming. The surveillance, the financial records, the recovered communications, the meetings with Soviet handlers. Investigators had spent months assembling a picture so complete that there was very little left to argue about. The mystery that had consumed the CIA for nearly 10 years was over. The damage was only beginning to be understood. As investigators reconstructed Ames's activities, the scale became difficult to comprehend. Dozens of operations compromised, entire intelligence networks destroyed, years of work erased. Some of the agency's most valuable Soviet sources had not simply disappeared. They had been identified, arrested, and in many cases executed. The losses stretched across nearly every level of Soviet intelligence collection. For a generation of CIA officers, it was the nightmare scenario they had trained for. Not an attack from outside, a collapse from within. Faced with overwhelming evidence, Ames agreed to plead guilty. Not because the investigation had uncovered one mistake or 10 mistakes, but because it had uncovered nearly all of them. The government had the money, the meetings, the documents, the timeline, and the bodies. Part of the agreement involved his wife, Rosario. Prosecutors agreed not to pursue the most severe penalties against her in exchange for Ames's cooperation. There would be no dramatic trial, no last-minute revelation, no uncertainty, only paperwork. In April 1994, Aldrich Ames was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The sentence was permanent. The consequences already were. For the families of the people he had betrayed, there would be no equivalent closure. No sentence could restore the years.